Today we're covering the question, how do I know when to hedge currency risk? The reason why I'm making this video is for both students and professionals. I frequently see these two extremes where either one, currency risk is oversimplified and it's either, oh, we always hedge or we never hedge. Or the other option is that they swing in the opposite direction and it becomes overly complicated and they get buried in the complexity of the math and they're overwhelmed and they don't really know where to begin. And so the purpose of this video is to provide some direction to ask the right questions so that as you gather the answers to the right questions, you know when to hedge currency risk. To simplify our analysis, we need just a couple assumptions. First, we're assuming that you're not managing a financial institution. It operates a little bit differently, so we're not going to be touching that today. Also, we're assuming that you don't have any currency information that the market doesn't know about. Also, we're assuming that the futures rate is the expected rate in the future. And for people who are not familiar with this, that seems obvious. But for those who know a little bit more about this, those two don't always match for a variety of reasons that are pretty complicated. But the difference between the two shouldn't be significant. So we're just going to assume that away at this point, as it should not be material for most corporations. To make the contrast clear, I wanted to walk through the wrong approach. And so the wrong approach is simply volatility is bad and stability is good, so we should always hedge. Now, risk is not the same as volatility, even though frequently in finance especially, we use the two terms interchangeably. But let me just walk through one example. Let's play a game, and in this game, we'll flip a coin, and heads you win $5 and tails you win $100. Now, is that a risky game to play? Now, some people might say yes, because there's volatility, but really no, because you either win or you win big. Volatility is not the same as risk. So risk should be in relation to your desired objectives of what you're trying to achieve. Now, when we talk about the wrong approach, when I've spoken with people from, say, corporate treasury departments before, they've said something like, my stockholders are stupid and they're going to sell our stock if there's volatility in our earnings. And I don't know, maybe in the short term there might be some effect like that. But really in the long term, for what we're trying to accomplish in a corporation, there are these three things. First is survivorship. There should be some bias towards survivorship, a small amount of risk aversion, because of, say, violations of Modigliani-Miller theorem and some other reasons. The second thing that we care about is earnings. This is what these corporations should be doing, economic value added. We take inputs and we create outputs, and the outputs are worth more than the inputs. That's what we're trying to accomplish here and create this prosperity and value. And the third is correlation with the market. Now, because of beta and because of correlation, it affects the valuation of our company. For now, we're just going to roll up correlation with the market into survivorship, just to simplify this analysis. But it doesn't dramatically change the analysis if we were to break out correlation with the market separately. All right, now that that's out of the way, we can finally get to the critical question and the critical table. And the question is what is the correlation between my operational cash flows and my currency gains and losses, the currency volatility, specifically when operational cash flow is tight, when things are going not well for the company? And this can be a tricky question to answer at first, but it becomes a little bit easier if we just walk through a few scenarios, assuming that we're hedging. And just to remind you, remember, we have no special information about whether currencies are going to go up or down, and we're focusing on making the best decision possible, not just trying to get lucky with a certain outcome. Now, the first thing to assume, remember that we're assuming we're hedging. So because of that, if we assume that we're hedging, and we also assume that no matter what happens and for the next year or 10 years or whatever it's going to be, that our company's solvent, it doesn't really make sense to hedge because we just lose our premiums and the work that it takes, the time it takes for us to hedge. And we really don't get anything out of it because on average, we're still solvent. It doesn't really affect anything. But then as we enter the zone of insolvency, so a zone of insolvency, it could mean bankruptcy, but it could also mean that we just have no cash lying around and so we're passing up on good projects or really good opportunities, and we're essentially damaging our company because we don't have the operational cash flows that we need. So we enter into this zone of insolvency. Let's say that this is going to happen sometime during the time horizon that we're considering. Now imagine that we're in the zone of insolvency, but the only reason why we stay solvent is because we hedged. The currency loss was going to be this tipping point between solvent and this zone of insolvency, and we're solvent because we hedge. So that was awesome. We hedged, and it was fantastic for our company. Great job. Pat on the back. Now let's say that you enter into this zone of insolvency and the currency really isn't a factor. Hedge or not hedge, like it doesn't matter. We're bankrupt either way. All right, then we're indifferent. It didn't really affect anything. In the end, we're bankrupt. It's not meaningfully different than before. And then finally, what if you enter into this zone of insolvency, but because of the volatility in the currency, you actually would have had currency gains, and because you hedged, you became insolvent. Or rather, if you did not hedge and you had currency gains, it actually would have rescued your company to exit out of this zone of insolvency. And so these two key cells in this table, the green and the red, that's really what we care about. Are we solvent because of the hedge, or are we insolvent because of the hedge? And really we care about the probabilities in relation to those two. What are the correlation between those two outcomes? So now that you know to focus on the red and the green cell, solvent because of hedge or insolvent because of hedge, you want to know the relative probabilities of each of those. But knowing the probabilities is hard. So predictions are difficult, especially ones about the future, as the saying goes. So where do we start? Well, the first thing to consider is the size and volatility of a currency in relation to the rest of the company. If you're a small company and you have a certain shipment and you're going to be collecting revenue from a certain customer that you need to cover your costs, if there's, say, a 15% currency swing that would potentially bankrupt you, well, that would make sense to hedge. If a 10 to 15% currency swing makes it so that you won't have the revenue that you need to cover your costs, this is huge in relation to the size of your company. Small companies actually run into this occasionally. So the analogy that I like to use is a game of roulette. Imagine you're the house in a game of roulette. And so you have, say, a 52 or 53% chance of winning. As long as, it doesn't end up on not red, your house, and you end up winning. Well, does it make sense to go all in every single time in this game of roulette? Well, no, because, 1, 2, 3 games in, you're going to lose, and then you've lost everything, and you can no longer play. But for big companies, this is more the exception rather than the rule. And so for larger companies, usually this isn't the case. And so what they need to focus on is actually getting those probabilities right. Now, the absolute probabilities, there's a 0.02 chance of this happening versus 0.03 of this other one, that's really difficult. But relative probabilities is actually doable to make those calculations. And you can do that through correlations between your operational cash flow performance and these currency swings, and you focus on the bad scenarios. When things go poorly, what are those correlations expected to be? To make this more concrete, let's use a simplified example with Apple. Now, most of Apple's sales are actually not in US dollars. They're throughout the entire world. And one thing that, let's say, Apple notices is that the US dollar appreciates when the world economy declines. And what that means is that there's this dollar exposure that's out there. Now, if the world economy declines and Apple's cash flows fall as well, they're also going to have this double whammy with currency losses that happen simultaneously. And they're aware of this, and they decide to mitigate this risk by actually hedging this dollar exposure. Just walking through each one of these steps and looking at the probability of the red cell from our table compared to the green cell, evaluating that risk, and making the appropriate decision. Many U.S. companies actually have this policy of, we just always hedge. And this has actually worked out really well for U.S. companies, I guess out of luck, maybe, because historically the U.S. dollar has been a safe haven currency or a reserve currency. And so when things have gone poorly in the economy, the U.S. dollar has tended to appreciate. And we've seen that throughout the last few recessions that we've seen globally. And here's one example. I took a 10-year window surrounding the 2008-2009 currency crisis or financial crisis. And in late 2008, September, October 2008, you can see the US dollar appreciated significantly right as everything started to go poorly. And so from a US company perspective, had they hedged, they would have been protected in this scenario when they were otherwise losing perhaps significant amounts of money with revenue that had sharply declined. So let's wrap it up. So should I hedge? Well, that primarily depends on your correlation between your operational cash flows and your currency gains and losses. If there's a negative correlation, it means if you hedge, you're actually increasing your risks of insolvency. If there's a positive correlation, it may make sense to hedge. And beyond this, it's not just the correlation, but what we care about is the bad scenarios specifically, when things are going really poorly. We don't really care as much or at all really about the good scenario. Now, to simplify this, if there's an exposure that's very large and volatile, it just makes sense to hedge, just like the roulette example. For US corporations, the strategy of always hedging has actually made a lot of sense because of reserve currency status. And so after you've walked through each one of these steps, if it does make sense to hedge, well, there are a variety of techniques for optimal hedging. We can cover that another day.